Being in jail gives you a lot of time to reflect on your own stupidity. However, I thought of nothing but hatred. I was focused on the hatred I felt for my boss, my soon-to-be ex-wife Carol, and the hatred I felt for myself for being so damn stupid. My name is Michael Arnold, and when I say I was stupid, I mean stupid with a capital S. I was stupid, like an ignorant husband who didn't know his wife was cheating on him, and she cheated with the person I hated most in my life, my boss, Jacob Sanders. I was also stupid because I didn't know that the cheating bitch was pregnant with his child. I, a stupid idiot, thought that the child was mine. I guess my wife's pregnancy is what precipitated her saying to me, "Honey, we need to talk." I suppose I should stop for a moment and explain everything. Oddly enough, my current problems actually began in first grade. I first came to know and eventually hate Jacob Sanders when we both entered first grade together. We've been enemies ever since he made fun of my freckles. This was the first of many fights. This match ended in a draw because the teacher pulled us away from each other. My nose was broken and he had a black eye. During our first 8 years of school, Jacob and I averaged fights about 3 times a year, with third grade being the worst. We had 7 fights. However, in 8th grade, we only had 1 fight for a good reason. I beat the crap out of him. I wanted nothing to do with Jacob and tried to stay away from him, but he wouldn't leave me alone. For some reason, he was jealous of me and constantly tried to outdo me. He tried to get better grades than me in each of our classes. He had a better understanding of science and literature. I was better at math and history. In other subjects, we were approximately equal. Jacob was pretty good at sports, but I was a little better. However, if I did any sport, Jacob would do the same and try to beat me. The fighting stopped, as I mentioned, after 8th grade, when Jacob realized he couldn't beat me. He then started trying to embarrass me or get me into trouble. He almost got me expelled and arrested when we were in high school. It was during my sophomore year that someone broke into the school and spray-painted graffiti in the hallways. The authorities found my student ID next to an empty can in a dumpster. The only thing that saved me was the fact that the day before I noticed my ID was missing from my wallet and reported it. I knew it was Jacob because I once saw him walk away from my locker after practice as I was getting out of the shower. I decided that he was up to something evil, so I checked everything in the locker. When I got to my wallet, I checked my cash first, and then looked through the rest. That's when I noticed my ID was missing. I immediately went to the main office and reported this. One day, Jacob brought a fart toy. He placed the device on the table where I was sitting and activated it. The sound of farts echoed through the classroom, and then Jacob began to hold his nose and wave his hand. "Mike, what did you have for lunch?" he chuckled. The class laughed, but I used an old saying, "Whoever smelled it, he swelled." The class erupted in laughter again, prompting a warning from Miss Wormwood that if Jacob and I continued to disrupt class, we would end up in detention. Being laughed at and then reprimanded by our teacher infuriated Jacob. He blushed brightly but didn't say anything. Apart from trying to get me expelled and maybe even arrested, Jacob's attempts at mischief were the most irritating. For the most part, I didn't care whether he was better than me or not. Apart from the usual teenage insecurities, I was pretty comfortable being who I was. However, there was one area that really excited me, and that was the girls. We were both pretty good-looking. However, Jacob's family was wealthy, which gave him an advantage over the girls at school. In 11th grade, he had his own car, and it wasn't an old jalopy. His parents bought him a BMW Z4, which cost $50,000. How could I compete with this? As it turns out, I was pretty enough to get my share of dates. On the other hand, Jacob dated cheerleaders and girls from the crowd. I figured they were out of my league anyway, so I didn't care. However, he was not satisfied with my rare success with girls. He should have tried to rub my nose in his success. If I dated a girl more than once, Jacob would swoop in and start dating that girl. And it didn't take her long to dump me. But even there, for the most part, I didn't care. I wasn't in a committed relationship with any of the girls, so if they wanted to date Jacob, I was fine with it. And yet there was one girl that I really liked. Her name was Sandy Springer, and she was smart, funny, and pretty. So when I started dating her, I took her to distant places, so Jacob wouldn't know I was interested in her. After a couple of months of dating, we decided to become permanent partners. I thought if Sandy wore my ring, I was safe. Remember, I mentioned that I'm stupid. And in this case, I was stupid too. Prom was approaching, and I just assumed Sandy and I would go together. I should have asked her right away, but I'm not sure it would have done any good. Anyway, after I bought the tickets, I mentioned it to Sandy over lunch. She blushed and said that she had accepted Jacob's invitation to go with him. I demanded and received my ring back. Then I left Sandy crying in the cafeteria, and he never spoke to her again. I was so angry at Sandy that I wanted to rip someone's head off. Instead, I saw Pam Taylor, captain of the cheerleading team and Jacob's supposed girlfriend. Under normal circumstances, I would never have dared to approach her. "Hi, Pam," I said cheerfully. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well. How about you, Michael?" she answered. Pam was great, but she was never arrogant. "I'm doing well," I said, figuring I had nothing to lose. "Tell me, would you like to go to prom with me?" "It's very nice of you to ask," she said kindly. "But I'm going with Jacob." "Oh," I feigned ignorance. "I must have misunderstood because I just heard that Jacob invited Sandy Springer. I must have mixed something up." "Yeah, forget I said anything. I'm sure I misheard." I left Pam flustered and talking to herself. Later, I heard that she and Jacob had a big fight. He may have stolen Sandy from me, but I ruined his romance with Pam. It wasn't entirely satisfactory, but it was better than nothing. But later that day, things got much better. "Michael?" Pam called out to me as I left the school. "Hi, Pam." I continued to feign innocence. "I'm sorry I upset you earlier." "Stop talking nonsense, Michael." Pam's eyes narrowed. "I found out that you were in an ongoing relationship with Sandy, and that creep, Jacob, stole your girlfriend." My ears were on fire. I got caught. "Yes, I'm sorry. I was just trying to get back at Jacob. I'm sorry you got caught in the crossfire." "Were you serious about taking me to prom?" "It doesn't matter," I began to say. "Never mind. Yes, I would be delighted if I could accompany you to the prom." "Good, because I want Reving too," Pam said. "And if you play your cards right, it can be a very memorable night." The graduation party was a real event for me. Not only did I take the most beautiful girl in school to prom, but I also made her feel like her prince. Pam was always there for me. I enjoyed the expressions on the other guys' faces. They couldn't believe she was there with me. And I don't know what Jacob thought was going to happen, but it definitely wasn't asking his girlfriend to go out with me. I guess Jacob thought Pam might go to prom as one of the football players' dates, but of course not with me. His eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw us enter the gym. All night he tried to get between me and Pam. He tried to get her to leave me and sit at his table. Pam turned him down. He asked her to dance many times, but Pam didn't give him the time of day. I really felt sorry for Sandy because she realized that Jacob was using her. Sandy finally stopped crying and asked her parents to pick her up. I still feel a little awkward about it even now, but she made her choice and had to live with it. After prom, Jacob was still trying to get Pam away from me. I was smart enough to realize that I was playing the part of Cinderella, and by tomorrow, Pam would probably be back with Jacob. But tonight, I was going to play my part to the best of my ability, and that led me to a local motel, where I had sex with the most beautiful girl in school. When I dropped Pam off, she gave me a big kiss and told me what a great guy I was. I went home floating on a cloud. But, as I expected, by the following Monday, Pam and Jacob were a couple again. Still, I smirked at Jacob every time he passed me in the hallway. Graduation arrived and most of us headed off to our chosen colleges. I was sad to leave my hometown and I was afraid of the unknown. But I wasn't sad to leave Jacob forever, or so I thought. I was accepted to Georgia Tech while Jacob was attending Harvard. Of course he was going to Harvard. There was even a building named after his grandfather. I did well at Georgia Tech, majoring in software engineering. I met Carol at a party during my first year of engineering school. I'm not going to bore you with the details of how we became friends, fell in love, and got married. Well, to tell you the truth, I think in the beginning we were more like really good friends than really lovers. Needless to say, our history wasn't all that memorable, and none of that matters now anyway. I'll say this about Carol. She was smart. She studied business at the University of Georgia. I liked her because she was not only smart, but also funny and very friendly. However, Carol didn't look super sexy. She was pretty, in a girl-next-door kind of way. Truth be told, Carol couldn't hold a candle to Pam, but she was about as pretty as Sandy. For some reason, we hit it off right away. We got married 3 months after graduating from high school, and in our 5 years of marriage, I thought we were pretty happy. Even though we were more friends than lovers when we married, by the 3rd year of our union, I was head over heels in love with Carol, and I think she was just as in love with me. We even talked about starting a family. Little did I know that my wife kind of rushed into it and started without me. Right after school, I got a job at Zaba Security Software, a small startup company. I graduated at the top of my class, so I had my choice of jobs. 2 brothers from Zaba sold me an infomercial about how to live on the ground floor and make a fortune. However, don't get me wrong, the company has done very well. The firm prospered and we performed quality work for several very large companies. Plus, I was paid a tidy 6-figure salary. Our job was to find security holes in the company's software and plug them. Our reputation grew, but then the brothers decided to cash out. To my surprise, we were acquired by a company about the same size as Zaba, and that's when my problems began. About 3 years after I started working for Zaba, Carol wanted a new job. It so happened that Zaba was looking for an office manager, so Carol applied and was hired. I was a little worried that we both worked for the same company, but at first everything worked out fine. We used to ride the bus and have lunch together. We worked in completely different departments and areas, so we rarely saw each other during the day. We came to work together, kissed each other, and went to our departments. If we were both free, which was most days, we would have lunch together and then drive home at the end of the day. We were good at it until it all went wrong. Before I tell you about the acquisition, let me tell you about my department. I was a senior programmer, which meant that I worked on projects myself and controlled the work schedule of the other 8 programmers who reported to me. But my main responsibility was to fix any problems that my team couldn't handle on their own. Luckily, there weren't many, which meant our customers were very happy. Our workspace was about half the size of a basketball court. We called it the bullpen and worked mostly standing at tables. The room was filled with all kinds of computers, servers, interfaces, and printers. We had almost all the computer equipment we could dream of. We took pride in making our customers' systems as secure as possible. In the 5 years I've been with the company, we've only had one complaint where a customer system was hacked. But we traced the hack to one of the company's employees. It disabled most of the software we installed. The employee was not very smart, but he really made us have a sleepless night. In addition to the 9 of us, we had an administrative assistant, Kimberly. It was like our Girl Friday. She prepared any correspondence or memos we needed. She kept track of our supplies and made sure we never ran out of anything. Kimberly also prepared our monthly statements and tracked billing times. Oddly enough, at first, most of our work was done with pencil and paper. This gave the programmer an overview before he started typing anything into the computer. Somehow, Kimberly was able to decipher everyone's handwriting and type notes for our files. Even though it wasn't her job description, Kimberly made us the best damn coffee every morning. Kimberly was about 23 or 24 years old, I would guess. She had short blonde hair, deep brown eyes, a very pretty face, but she was about 50 pounds overweight. Considering that Kimberly was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, this was a lot of weight for her. Even though she had a pretty face, her big belly and butt immediately ruined the image. I knew that Kimberly was sensitive about her weight because she always talked about how fat she was. I felt embarrassed every time she did this, but I knew it was just her defense mechanism. All I cared about was that Kimberly was damn good at her job and was an asset to my team. The fact that Zaba was sold came like a bolt from the blue. The 2 Zaba brothers didn't even have the courage to tell the employees in person. They asked their lawyer to make an announcement. I was furious because all the stock options the brothers had promised when they went public went up in smoke with the announcement. Besides, I didn't know what to do with this change. Carol was just as upset and confused by the news as I was, but she was the one who convinced me to stay the course until we saw what the new owners would do. They sent a senior vice president to oversee the transition. At first, he concentrated on the main office. When I joined the firm, Zaba's employee count had grown from 5 to more than 150. From what I heard, the person at the new corporate headquarters was supposed to start in the accounting department. Then he was going to work his way through the entire company. Not even 2 days later, I learned that the vice president reviewing Zaba's security software was none other than Jacob Sanders. However, at the same time I learned that Jacob was leading the transition process. I also learned that our pay scale will be aligned with the parent company. My salary will be increased by $35,000, and Carol's salary will be increased by $15,000. My internal alarm was telling me to run instead of just walking towards the nearest exit. However, Carol convinced me that it would be foolish to leave our current job, especially after the salary increase. Additionally, she indicated that Jacob would only be there for 6 months at most, and then he would be gone. The first change occurred when 4 new programmers were hired and assigned to the bullpen. Sure, they were all Harvard graduates, but none of them were a tenth as good as anyone on my existing team. Not only were they poor programmers, but they were also arrogant and had an inordinate sense of entitlement. All 4 of them immediately started pestering Kimberly. Sometimes it was sexual harassment, and sometimes it was just meanness. I tried to advise them and point out that their behavior was unacceptable. However, they didn't stop. Instead, they just pestered Kimberly when they thought I wasn't around. Finally, I called all 4 of them into the conference room and read them the riot act. They got off with empty words, but I could tell they weren't going to stop. Aside from their harassment of Kimberly, all 4 of them were a pain in the ass. Nobody on my team liked them, and they did more harm than good when it came to their work. Eventually, I decided I wanted them to leave. Unfortunately, I didn't have the authority to fire them because Jacob hired them. I knew if I demanded that he fire them, Jacob would simply ignore me. I knew that Kimberly got up early every day to make coffee and get the office ready. Ever since I chided the 4 idiots for their treatment of Kimberly, I noticed that they all started coming earlier. Finally, I realized that they were using the time before my arrival to torture the poor girl. I knew Kimberly was getting to the point where she was going to quit. I also knew that she loved working at Zaba and needed the job, so I decided to come early and catch them doing this. Hidden in a supply cabinet next to our small kitchen, I kept my cell phone ready. As I expected, Kimberly arrived and started making coffee. A few minutes later, the 4 of them arrived, and the torment began. "Hey, Euler!" Ted, the gang leader, grinned at Kimberly. "Show us your chest." Fred, another of the 4, added, "I want to see your big fat ass. I'm going to pull your panties down and fuck it." "Yes," said the other 2. "We will even help you undress." I saw tears rolling down Kimberly's face, and I couldn't take it anymore. I had more than enough evidence, so I came out of the closet. "You 4, pack your things and leave. You guys are done." "You don't have the authority to fire us," Fred retorted. "Mr. Sanders hired us, and he said only he could fire us." "It's true," I said with a nasty smile on my face. "However, I have evidence that you sexually assaulted Kimberly. So let me explain what your options are. You 4 can either resign immediately, or I will turn over this video to the police. So the choice is yours. Either you resign, or I call the police. I'll give you 15 minutes to make a decision. You can even run to Jacob if you want, but I'm sure he's not going to stick his ass out to protect you scum." 15 minutes later, I had all 4 resignations, and all 4 had left. Kimberly's face showed extreme relief and gratitude. "Kimberly," I called her to my table after all 4 of them had left. "I apologize for what these 4 put you through. I should have acted sooner. If anything like this ever happens again, promise me that you will come to me immediately. You are a wonderful person, and these 4 are just assholes." Kimberly sobbed softly and thanked me for protecting her. I told her it was part of my job, but I wasn't very good at it, so she had to suffer at the hands of these idiots for too long. "Mr. Arnold, you have no idea how much this means to me," she said, holding back tears. I was going to quit, but I didn't know what I would do without this job. I didn't know if I could find another job that was just as good. Again, Kimberly, I'm so sorry you had to put up with this garbage. I can see you're upset. If you want to take the rest of the day off, I'll make sure it doesn't count toward your personal or sick days. Thank you, Mr. Arnold, but I'd rather stay here at work. After that day, it seemed like Kimberly was doing everything she could for me. I tried to tell her that I was just doing my job, and I kept insisting that I wasn't doing a very good job because of what she suffered. Of course, I was called into Jacob's office as soon as he learned that I had forced his programmers to resign. I want these programmers hired again, he demanded as soon as I crossed the threshold of his office. This won't happen, I said decisively. I have evidence that these 4 assholes sexually assaulted and abused our department's administrative assistant. If you want to hire them back, go ahead. But I can guarantee that a lawsuit will be filed against all 4 of them, the parent company and you. I don't think your bosses would think too highly of it. Jacob glared at me, but then smiled and relented. He tried to pretend he didn't know all the details, but that night I realized that he was lying. Carol came home and attacked me for being an asshole to Jacob. She thought I was a jerk for threatening our boss. At that moment, I should have known what Jacob was up to because my gut was screaming danger. But when everything returned to normal at home, I brushed off the incident. At the end of the day, I still believed that Carol loved me and only me. If I had listened to my intuition, I might not be in prison now. But I was stupid and allowed Jacob and my wife to lull me into a false sense of well-being. And in 2 months of merging, nothing has changed between Carol and me. I found out that the company that acquired us was called Unity Software. They were about the same size as us, but mostly had government contracts. Zaba gave them the opportunity to enter the commercial market. And no, Jacob's father did not own the company. His family's fortune was made in the pipe and electrical wiring industry. However, Jacob's father sold the business while Jacob was still in college. I could say a lot of nasty things about Jacob, but I couldn't say he was incompetent. In fact, he did a great job of bringing the 2 companies together. In fact, he convinced the board to keep the Zaba name because it had a better reputation. What I didn't know was that Jacob had completed his job of merging the 2 companies in 8 weeks. After that, he launched the process of seducing my gullible wife in full force. Just like Sandy in high school, Jacob was able to win over Carol. Despite my warnings about him, Carol seemed fascinated by the asshole and constantly commented on what a great job he was doing. I kept warning her about Jacob, but she just told me I was jealous. 4 months into her transition, Carol announced she was pregnant. I was in 7th heaven. However, our sex life was faltering. This went from 3 times a week to once every 2 weeks. I chalked it up to Carol being pregnant. Then our lunches together stopped, and finally Carol stopped going to work with me. The culmination of all this was the conversation. Carol stopped me one morning before I left for work. I was a little surprised to find that she was still at home, since lately she had been leaving at least an hour before me. "Michael, we need to talk," she said, motioning for me to sit on the couch. I sat down as asked, confused by what was so important that we had to discuss it early in the morning. However, what Carol told me rocked my whole world. "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this," Carol said with a hard look in her eyes. "But I fell in love with Jacob, and he fell in love with me." I just looked at her for a long time. I studied her face, and what I realized was that she had no regrets. Finally, I exploded. "Are you out of your fucking mind? I told you Jacob is an asshole, and he will try to drive a wedge between us. I can't believe you fell for his complete bullshit." "He's not an asshole," Carol flushed. "He's a kind and loving man. He understands me, and that's something you never had." I felt my soul breaking with every word Carol said. At this point, I was desperate, so I chose something that I hoped would bring her to her senses. "What about our unborn child?" I asked quietly. "Doesn't this mean anything to you?" "The baby is not yours," Carol said with a forced smile. I was stunned by her statement. "It's a lie." "No, that's not true," she said. "We didn't have sex for 2 weeks when I got pregnant." Now I was beside myself with rage. "You lying slut! You had sex with that piece of shit. This is my body, and I can do whatever I want with it, she shouted to me. I don't belong to you. Devastation is not even the word to describe what I felt. But my father once advised me to never show a woman that she has hurt you. Maintaining my composure was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But I was able to restrain myself and grin at her. You said Jacob understands you in a way I never did, I said with a forced laugh. You're right. He understands. He understands that you're a stupid, gullible bitch. God, you're so stupid. But you know what? You deserve each other. He's a fucking asshole and you're a fucking slut. Fuck you, Michael, Carol raged. No, this will never happen again, I said calmly. But just so you know, I'm not moving out of this house. You can live with Jacob in his apartment. We'll see about that. Carol turned and headed to the bedroom. What a fucking nightmare I found myself in. Finding out that my loving wife had been cheating on me with Jacob all this time was too much for me to bear. I wanted to beat the crap out of this bitch, but I just didn't have the heart to hit the woman. Jacob, on the other hand, I had no doubts about. I cried all the way to work, but eventually I pulled myself together. Well, this is all an outright lie. I was filled with pure rage. Along the way, I decided that I would resign and beat the crap out of Jacob, but not necessarily in that order. I ran into Jacob as he walked through the company's front door. He didn't seem at all alarmed to see me and even grinned at me. The thought crossed my mind that it would be so much like Carol to take it upon herself to drop her little bomb on me without consulting Jacob. She was very independent. Jacob, on the other hand, I suspected, had no intention of telling me about the baby until it was born. Then he took both my wife and newborn child at the same time. This would be his final victory over me. Rage filled me as I approached him. He just kept grinning. At that moment, I exploded and punched him in the nose and then in the mouth. I gave him 2 hard punches to the groin, and as he started to fall, I uppercutted him. I left him curled up in front of the door as the guards rushed to help. I later learned that he had lost 3 teeth in addition to a broken nose. He also suffered a ruptured genital organ. I didn't come out completely unscathed, as I broke 2 fingers on my left hand. I headed to the bullpen and began packing all my personal belongings and documents. Kimberly saw me, and I saw the worry and fear on her face. What's happened? She asked with genuine concern. Jacob had sex with my wife behind my back, and now she's leaving me for him. I just beat the crap out of him, so I guess I'm fired. And even if I don't get fired, I'll quit. The rest of my staff were shocked to hear what had happened. Not only was my team upset with me, but they were also very worried about their own individual performance. I assured them that what I did would not affect their future work. Once the staff were reassured that they wouldn't get hurt because of my stupidity, I went back to packing my things. But I never finished because the police arrived and I was arrested. I expected this to be my fate, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. Once I was handcuffed, I asked Kimberly if she would gather the rest of my belongings and take them home with her. After I was photographed, fingerprinted, and given paper towels to dry my fingers, I was allowed to make a phone call. But I didn't know who to call. My parents went on a cruise. They also lived 2,000 miles away in San Diego, while I lived in Nashville. I certainly wasn't going to call Carol. Finally, I decided to call Kimberly. Maybe she could find me a lawyer. However, when I called Zaba, the receptionist told me that Kimberly was gone for the day. After that, I didn't know what to do, so I just sat in my cell, either angry as hell or wondering how I could get my wife back. One thought continued to rage in my head. How could Carol betray me in such a cold and heartless way? Then the thought of revenge overshadowed everything else. As the day dragged on and I languished in prison, I began to realize that Jacob already had a plan. My problems were just beginning. I know Jacob didn't expect the beating he received today. However, I was convinced that Jacob expected me to attack him as soon as I discovered his betrayal. Only he believed that he could do this at any time and place of his choosing. I think I ruined that part of his plan. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was brought before the judge to face charges. I was assigned a public defender because I did not have a lawyer. To my horror, he looked like a teenager with a bad complexion. Not only did my lawyer look like a child, but he also seemed to know nothing about me or my case. He quickly tried to read the file when the judge got angry at him. "Lawyer," the judge barked, "it's really simple. Will your client plead guilty or not guilty?" The kid looked at me like a deer staring in the headlights. So I intervened and firmly stated not guilty. "Thank God," the judge sighed. "Bail is set at $2,500, cash or check." I carried almost no cash and did not carry blank checks with me. So I looked up at the judge. "Sorry, Your Honor, but I don't have much cash and I don't carry blank checks. Is there any way I could contact a bail bondsman? My secretary will help you with this and she will let you know when your court date is set," he said. But before he could name the next thing, I heard a voice behind me. "I'll post bail for him." I turned around and saw Kimberly waving a checkbook. I was stunned to see her in the courtroom and very touched that she cared enough to come and help me. "I'll give you your money back as soon as I can get to the ATM," I assured Kimberly. "I'm not worried about it," she said quietly, looking at my swollen hand. "This is very painful?" "In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't even compare to the pain of Carol's betrayal." "Anyway, boss," Kimberly said, looking me in the eyes, "I think your wife is a very stupid bitch. She made a huge mistake by trading you for Jacob." I smiled at my administrative assistant. "Thank you, that's very kind of you." At that moment, a young man stood in front of me. "Are you Michael Arnold?" When I said, "Yes," he handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised, but the speed with which I was handed the documents left no doubt that Jacob and Carol had been planning this for some time. It was just another blow to my heart. "Let's get something to eat after I withdraw some cash from the ATM," I said dejectedly. However, when I tried to access my account, I was denied. I called the bank, and they told me that all my accounts were frozen. This will remain in effect until the court overturns it. Yes, now I know that you can petition the court for relief from a complete freeze on your assets. But I didn't know that then. I also found out that my other savings account was frozen and my credit cards were canceled. A quick check of my wallet revealed that I had $126 plus a $100 bill tucked into one of the folds. "Apparently Carol and Jacob froze all my money," I told Kimberly. "I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but at least I can buy you dinner." "No, it's not like that," Kimberly protested. "You come to my house and I'll cook dinner for us." I had to admit that I liked Kimberly's suggestion. It didn't make sense for me to spend what little money I had on dining out. We stopped at Zaba, picked up my car, and I followed Kimberly to her apartment. I couldn't believe how helpful this woman was to me. I mean, she was just a work colleague. I was going to give her every last cent and more as soon as I could sort out my finances. At dinner, I was really depressed, not only because of the betrayal, but my 2 fingers hurt like hell. I put ice on them as soon as I got to Kimberly, but they still hurt. After watching me wince in pain, Kimberly finally pulled out a bottle of Percocet she had bought for a root canal. I took one of these, and within half an hour the pain had subsided significantly. Still, I was not in good company. "They really did this to me. This number," I complained. "I completely screwed up, got glued and covered in tattoos. I can't even think about getting revenge on Jacob or Carol right now, because it will definitely come back to me like a boomerang. But someday I'll pay those 2 bastards back in full." "Mr. Arnold," Kimberly said in a soft voice. "Please call me Michael," I insisted. "I'm not your boss anymore. Besides, what you did for me today makes you a very good friend." Kimberly smiled and continued. "Michael, my mother cheated on my father and left him for another man. I had to live with her, and I hated her every minute. Her lover was an asshole just like Jacob. He was never married. On my mother, but they lived together for 10 years before he found someone younger to run away with. My father was bitter and tried to take revenge on my mother for many years. He was imprisoned several times and eventually died a broken man. Don't waste your life trying to get revenge. In the end, my father told me that he really regrets letting my mother's betrayal ruin him. He wishes he could just move on and forget that bitch. Today, my mom lives alone in the nursing home, where she struggles with respiratory problems caused by years of smoking. I visit her once a week, although I still don't like her very much. And every week I have to listen to her lament about what a mistake she made by leaving my father. So please don't waste your life trying to get revenge. I told her she was probably right. However, at that moment, I had no intention of letting these treacherous bastards off the hook. The anger was still bubbling under the surface, and I wanted my pound of flesh. After I helped wash the dishes, I told Kimberly that I needed to go and find a cheap motel. Her reaction was immediate. "No, you don't have to do that. You'll spend the night here. I have a spare bedroom, and you're welcome to it." Kimberly, you were the only ray of sunshine in the hole that is now my life. I can't force myself on you anymore. First of all, this is not an imposition, she insisted. Secondly, if you sleep here, I can go to work tomorrow and find out what's going on. Again, Kimberly made a lot more sense than I did, so I accepted her invitation. Around mid-morning the next day, Kimberly called me to tell me that I had indeed been fired. She then told me to turn on her computer and type out an email instructing HR to send my latest check to her address. Shirley, the head of HR, wasn't sure if the company was required to pay for my vacation and sick leave, but she felt it should still be stated in the letter. But the courts froze all my money, I pointed out. Shirley told me the court order only applies to bank accounts, so deliver the letter quickly before Jacob or Carol realize what you're doing. I did as Kimberly suggested and received a fax back saying I would receive a check in a couple of days for $4,125.57. The fax also said they had to check state law to determine whether the company must pay vacation or sick leave. As it turns out, they didn't. Nevertheless, getting almost $5,000 was a great success. When Kimberly got home, she told me that Jacob wasn't there that day, but Carol was, and she was mad at me for ruining her boyfriend. For some reason, this amused both Kimberly and me. I decided to stay at Kimberly's until I received my check. During this time, I compiled a resume and began actively looking for work. I quickly discovered that Jacob and Carol had blacklisted me. Since I worked in cybersecurity, no one would take a chance on me if I had a criminal charge hanging over my head. When my check arrived, I gave it to Kimberly and she deposited it into her account. I didn't want to risk opening a new account only to have it frozen too. Again, when I told Kimberly that I would stop bothering her and get my own apartment, she was upset. Kimberly pointed out that I probably couldn't even rent a doghouse without a checking account. Plus, if they checked my credit score right now, it would probably show that I'm in financial trouble. "Listen, please, just stay here until you get a new job," she urged me. "In the meantime, you can find a lawyer." In the end, I agreed. The lawyer I hired me when I paid him a fee of $2,000. However, it was money well spent because he immediately went to court to allow me access to a reasonable amount of money from our checking and savings accounts. The courts allowed me to spend enough to provide a minimum lifestyle. This, of course, included paying my lawyer. I had been at Kimberly's apartment for 8 days and thought it was time to leave. So I found an apartment in her complex and paid the required deposit for it. That Saturday, Kimberly helped me buy minimal furniture for my new home. I also invited her to dinner, which I promised. Kimberly wanted to go to the Olive Garden, which I also like. As I ate, I studied her more closely. She had the face of an angel, but the extra 50 pounds she carried detracted from that beauty. And I could tell that Kimberly was very self-conscious about her weight. Then I came up with an idea that I hoped she wouldn't find offensive. I turned this over in my head, deciding how best to present this proposal. "I just discovered that there is a gym in our complex," I said casually. "I'd like to take advantage of this, but I'd really like to have someone to go with. Would you be interested?" "Do you really want to be seen with me?" she asked, moving her hands up and down her sides, pointing out her extra weight. "Yes, I do," I said readily. "Unless you want to be seen with a potential criminal." My comment got exactly the reaction I wanted. Kimberly really didn't want to go to the gym because she didn't want anyone to see her body. However, Kimberly did not want to offend me at all, so she agreed. We agreed to go there 4 times a week at 6 in the morning because there was never anyone there. After the first week, Kimberly realized that she didn't have to worry about being embarrassed and began to enjoy the sessions. I kept looking for work, but no one in the security software business was interested in me, at least until my case is considered. And in talking with my lawyer, I learned that there was a high probability that I would be found guilty of assault. And yet, he was secretive. He never told me what to say or lie. However, he said that if I had gone into a blind rage over my boss and wife's infidelity, that might have been a mitigating factor. And if I couldn't remember what actually happened, the court would certainly have to consider that too. On the day of my trial, Kimberly took time off from work and came with me. I really appreciate her support. When my lawyer learned that Judge Parker would be the presiding judge, he convinced me to petition for a right of habeas corpus. This is where the judge makes the decision, not the jury. My lawyer explained that this would make the judge happy, and besides, Judge Parker hated cheaters. The prosecutor presented 3 witnesses to the alleged attack. They talked about what they saw and heard. My lawyer cross-examined them, getting them all to admit that they didn't see the fight start or hear me threaten Jacob. They couldn't even say categorically that Mr. Sanders didn't throw the first punch. Jacob was then called to the stand where he told his story. Naturally, Jacob went into detail about what was described as an unprovoked attack. Jacob emphasized that he didn't even throw a single punch, and then listed the injuries he received. My lawyer asked him about his relationship with my wife. Jacob lied and said they were just friends. When asked about the child my wife was carrying, he told the judge that, as far as he knew, it was mine. When Jacob came down from the podium, he grinned at me and returned to his seat. I was the only witness my lawyer called on my behalf, and all he did was ask me to describe what happened that day, leading up to the alleged attack, and what I remember about the incident. So I explained how my wife had blindsided me that morning by telling me she was divorcing me to marry my boss. I was especially devastated when my wife told me that the child I thought was my own was actually Jacob's child. I explained that she was the love of my life, but she threw me away like an old pair of shoes. I told the judge that I remember seeing Jacob at the door and him smirking at me. After that, I lied and said I didn't remember anything until I was at my desk throwing things into a box. The prosecutor tried to confuse me with my memories. He kept trying to get back to the timeline. The truth was that I was so furious that morning that I had no idea of the time. And the more he questioned me and tried to get me to stick to certain times and activities, the more it became obvious that I had no idea. He then asked me if I really thought the court would believe that I fortunately had no memory of the attack. I told him that on the way to work I had a bad headache and saw flashes of light, which was actually true. I repeated that all I remembered was Jacob smirking at me. He then asked me if I knew for sure that the child my wife was carrying was Jacob's. I replied that all I could tell him was what my wife said. Carol didn't show up in court because no one bothered to subpoena her. My lawyer told me that he thought my wife would be a wild card that he didn't want to touch. I'm guessing the prosecutor felt the same way. After I finished, the judge retired to his office to discuss his verdict, but returned 10 minutes later. "It is clear to me," said Judge Parker, "that Mr. Arnold was betrayed in the most cowardly and shameful manner. I believe that this shock to his nervous system resulted in a serious mental disorder. I believe that Mr. Arnold was temporarily insane, and therefore I believe him innocent." "It's outrageous!" Jacob roared from his seat before Judge Parker brought down his gavel with force, threatening to hold Jacob accountable for contempt of court. The sight of Jacob flushed with anger gave me pleasure. Jacob's victory over me had just been dealt a small blow. And yet, I just as badly wanted to take revenge on him. However, having just avoided jail time, I would have to put any thoughts of revenge on hold for the foreseeable future. Besides, I had no idea how to retaliate against one of them. Jacob was waiting for me outside the courtroom. I toyed with the idea of trying to encourage him to attack me, but I wasn't sure how this would turn out, so I just called the bailiff. I shouldn't be within 500 feet of this man, but he's stopping me from leaving. The bailiff looked at Jacob and told him to move on. Jacob shouted over his shoulder, "This isn't over! I'll sue you!" This bothered me, so I asked my lawyer, "Can he sue me?" "Anyone can sue anyone else," he said with a smile, "but his case is weak. But if you really want to pull the rug out from under him, don't admit to anything other than offering to pay for his medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance. So, that's exactly what I did in the letter addressed to his office. Jacob never responded or filed a lawsuit. Since my trial, it has been just over 9 weeks since Carol broke the devastating news to me. Although I was still seething with hatred, the victory in court lifted my spirits a little, so I decided to invite Kimberly to dinner. I also had some exciting news to share with her. At this point, let me dissuade any readers who think that my story will follow the usual script. I have read many similar stories about husbands who were betrayed just like me. These stories make it seem like all the affected husbands are starting their own businesses. Then the deceived husband becomes fabulously rich, and his ex-wife realizes that she made a huge mistake by leaving him. This should never have happened to me. I'm just a worker bee. I'm a good worker bee, but just a worker bee. Kimberly and I agreed to meet at a small Italian restaurant. She had to work a little longer that evening because things weren't going well in my old department. There was nothing serious. They were just adjusting to the fact that I wasn't there. Anyway, when she came in, she looked wonderful. Kimberly was still fat, but it was obvious that she had lost weight, and the dress she wore suited her very well. I stood up and kissed her on the cheek. "Wow, you look wonderful. You've lost weight, haven't you?" Kimberly beamed. "Yes, I've lost 16 pounds. Sorry I didn't notice earlier, but you're wearing those oversized sweatshirts and sweatpants. Anyway, like I said, you look wonderful." The restaurant was small and cozy. It was exactly the kind of place couples would choose for a date. But I didn't think of it as a date. It was just a meeting between two close friends. "I asked you to have dinner with me tonight because I wanted to celebrate my victory in court, and I have some news. I got a job." "This is wonderful," Kimberly beamed. "Who are you going to work for?" "Sable Security from Jacksonville, Florida," I replied. "I didn't know they had an office here," Kimberly said worriedly. "They don't have it here. I'll have to move to Jacksonville." I was completely surprised when the light went out in Kimberly's eyes and tears started running down her cheeks. "I thought you'd be happy for me," I said, confused. "I'm happy you got a job," Kimberly said, still crying. "But you'll be 600 miles away." "Kimberly, do you remember how you told me not to let my wife's betrayal consume me with hatred?" She nodded. Now I realize that the only way I can do this is to put some distance between me and Carol and let time do the rest. "I understand," Kimberly said, wiping her eyes. "I'm just going to miss you. I really enjoyed having a friend." "Hey, I'm just a phone call away," I said, trying unsuccessfully to cheer her up. I was truly surprised by Kimberly's reaction. Then it occurred to me that she probably didn't have many friends, so I made another suggestion. "You could come and visit me if you want. I don't know what Jacksonville has to offer, but I'll find out." "Do you really want me to come visit?" she asked. "Of course," I said quickly. "Remember, I won't have any friends there either." "When are you leaving?" Kimberly finally asked. "I'll start packing in another 45 days, but before then I have a lot to do. I need to find somewhere to live, open a new checking account at a bank there. I also have to take a lie detector test, get fingerprinted, and pass a test on drugs. I figure it will take at least 2 trips there to get it all done." After this, her mood improved somewhat. But I noticed that Kimberly was not eating very much. I thought she was still a little upset. In fact, as the time approached for me to leave, Kimberly became sadder every day. She seemed to be hoping for something more between us. I have to admit that this confused me because I felt that Kimberly could do it much better than me. I spent my last night before heading to my new job at Kimberly's apartment. She prepared a delicious dinner and topped it with a chocolate cake with the words, "I'll miss you," written on it. After I helped her clean up, we watched TV until it was time for bed. I pecked her on the lips before heading to the guest room. Somewhere during the night, I felt the bed move slightly and a body slide next to me. I was still half asleep when I realized it was Kimberly, and she was naked. I froze for a second when she lowered her hand between my legs. When I turned to face Kimberly, she pressed herself against my body, and I felt her silky, smooth skin. Her soft breasts were pressed against my chest, and it all felt wonderful. I kissed her right on the lips, and she responded with desperate passion. Her breathing became erratic, and I knew she was close to climax, and I was doing virtually nothing. When I started fondling her breasts, it pushed her over the edge, and she climaxed. Then we made love. When I was exhausted, I clung to Kimberly while she sobbed. I was worried that maybe I had hurt her, or she was angry that I had taken advantage of her, or something like that. "What's wrong, Kimberly?" I asked, almost in panic. "Did I hurt you?" "No, I'm just so happy," Kimberly said, resting her head on my chest. "I've had sex with 5 or 6 men before, but this is the first time I've made love. Thank you." We lay there for several long minutes before Kimberly slipped out of my bed. She took 2 steps towards the door and then came back to me. She leaned over and kissed me. "Will you sleep with me in my bed tonight?" I was more than happy to oblige, if for no other reason than that my bed was soaking wet. Besides, being in bed with Kimberly seemed like the perfect way to spend my last night in this city. The next morning, I woke up to Kimberly paying attention to my manhood. We made love again. I have never seen more pure pleasure and tenderness on a person's face than on Kimberly's face that morning. Afterwards, we took a shower together, and it was there that I realized that Kimberly was about 3/4 of the way to becoming a cold-blooded fox. She was already way out of my league, but I will cherish this night for the rest of my life. After breakfast, I checked my car one last time to make sure I had everything. Then I turned to Kimberly and kissed her. She responded with perhaps the most passionate kiss I've ever received. Then, unfortunately, it was time for me to leave. As my car pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Kimberly sit down on the curb. She covered her head with her hands and began to sob. I desperately didn't want to leave her, but I knew it was for the best. I was still in love with Carol, and therefore I was damaged goods. It was kind of funny, though, because I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I just had a deep sadness deep in my heart. Jacksonville was a fascinating city, but I didn't get to see much of it. I jumped into my new job with both feet. I worked long hours not only to keep myself busy, but also because it helped me forget about Carol. I kept in touch with Kimberly, and she always seemed so excited when she heard from me, and so sad when our phone conversation ended. It was from her that I heard the news that I was so afraid of. Carol and Jacob got married about a month after their divorce was finalized. I also learned that Carol had a baby girl. For some reason, this news didn't bother me as much. Perhaps I was beginning to recover from the pain and humiliation. It is true that I rarely have sleepless nights now. I also rarely woke up in the morning depressed because Carol wasn't with me in bed. Kimberly came and spent 4 days with me in March. Since we hadn't seen each other for some time, we weren't sure about our relationship. We kind of danced around the topic of sex and didn't sleep together until the last 2 nights. But then it was almost as intense as that first time. Only this time I had rubber products on hand. Maybe 4 dozen is overly optimistic, but I actually used 6 of them over those 2 nights. About a year after that, I was told that I could hire an administrative assistant for my team. Sable Security was much larger than my old company. While Zaba had 1 team dedicated to cybersecurity, we had 6. And over that year, I went from being a simple member of 1 team to its leader. Since the decision about who to hire was mine, I immediately called Kimberly. I barely had time to explain the job to her before she said she wanted it. When I met Kimberly at the airport, my breath caught. As I predicted, she was great. I saw the man's head turn sharply as she exited the passenger compartment, but all she wanted to do was get to me. She threw herself into my arms and kissed me with a passion that made my knees buckle. The plan was for Kimberly to stay with me until she found her own apartment. I figured it would only take about a week, but the search dragged on week after week. There was something wrong with every apartment she inspected. I didn't complain because Kimberly and I slept in the same bed. It's funny that during the 1.5 years that I spent in Jacksonville, I continued to think about Carol less and less. And when Kimberly appeared, I stopped thinking about her altogether. However, I knew Kimberly would eventually move out, and I dreaded that day. 5 weeks later, I asked Kimberly about the situation in her apartment, and she started crying. I was completely dumbfounded. I knew I made her cry, but for the life of me, I didn't know why. "Sorry," I apologized. "Did I say something wrong? Do you want me to leave?" Kimberly asked timidly. "Hell no," I said decisively. "I would like you to stay forever, but I know that one day you will want to leave. I just need a little time to prepare. I would ask you to marry me, but you are too good for me." "No, it's not like that," Kimberly protested. "I've loved you almost since the day I started working at Zaba. I would marry you in a heartbeat." This changed everything for us. That day we went ring shopping and started planning our wedding. Even though I was terrified that Kimberly would eventually leave me for someone else, I was so in love with her that I had to take the risk. 6 months later, Kimberly and I got married. A year after that, Kimberly gave birth to a little boy whom we named Mikey Jr. A year and a half later, we had a little girl named Charlotte. I have now moved up at Sable to the point where I lead all 8 cybersecurity teams. Yes, we have added 2 more. Kimberly, on the other hand, chose to be a stay-at-home mom. It was near Christmas 3 years later when I was called to a meeting. It was at this meeting that I learned that Sable was planning to acquire Zaba Security Software. I would be part of the team that would conduct due diligence before the acquisition was completed. During the years that Kimberly and I were married, Kimberly's mother died and my parents retired. They moved to Jacksonville to be closer to their grandchildren and me. With them as babysitters, I planned to use the week's vacation as a mini vacation. I would also use Kimberly's skills as an administrative assistant to assist me in my investigation. That way, I could take Kimberly to work with me every day, where she could meet some of the people she worked with, and we could sneak away for long lunches together. I learned 4 things during my week in Nashville. First, I learned that this facility was the only place where Zaba did its cybersecurity work. Second, Jacob was named Chief Operating Officer and Carol was the Senior Project Manager. Third, despite my animosity toward Jacob, I found that he steered the ship tightly. I found his entire operation, from my point of view, to be first class. And the last thing I knew was that Zaba was having a Christmas party on Friday night, and I had to go. Other than our team's first introduction to Jacob, I had no contact with him. Besides, I didn't see Carol once all week. However, at the Christmas party, everything changed. Zaba rented a ballroom at the Hilton Doubletree in downtown Nashville. It was festively decorated, tables stood around the perimeter of the dance floor, and a group of 5 people sat in one of the corners. They played soft Christmas carols, soft background music, and sometimes added old songs. After dinner and speeches, there was to be dancing. There was also an open bar, much to everyone's delight. And it attracted more and more attention as more and more people arrived. Jacob, Carol, and some of the senior leaders from Zaba decided to welcome the Sable team. I wasn't looking forward to it. I didn't know how I would react to having to face Jacob and Carol together. However, my fears were in vain. Jacob, I already knew, looked about the same, and Carol, although looking a little older, still looked good. Strangely, I didn't feel anything when they came to greet us. "Mike, I'm glad you were able to join us tonight," Jacob said nervously. "I hope our past differences will not interfere with the acquisition." "Not from me," I assured him. "It's ancient history." "And who is this vision of beauty?" Jacob smiled widely and took Kimberly's hand. "This is my beloved wife, Kimberly," I said, kissing her on the cheek. Jacob's smile fell as he looked at Kimberly and then at me. Kimberly smirked at Jacob. "Don't you remember me, Jacob? I was Michael's administrative assistant when he worked for Zaba, but I traded that to become Michael's wife. It was a huge promotion for me." Jacob's eyes narrowed even more, but he tried to put a smile back on his face. However, she didn't seem sincere. "Of course it was so long ago. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you." Jacob moved on, but his eyes continued to wander to Kimberly and me. Then Carol slid next to me. "Michael, you look really good," she said, taking my hand. "And your wife is gorgeous. I didn't know you got married." "We'll be married for 7 years in March," Kimberly said with a smile, hugging my arm. Both you and Jacob look good, I replied, and then asked, "How is your daughter doing?" Carol cringed at first, but then smiled. "She's doing great. Tammy is in 2nd grade and her brother Jacob Jr. is in kindergarten. Do you guys have kids?" "2," Kimberly answered. "Mickey Jr. is in daycare and Charlotte is still at home with me. They're both doing well. Thanks for asking." Carol then moved on, and soon after, Kimberly and I walked away to find our table. The food was excellent, and the speeches were fortunately short. Sable's CEO simply assured everyone that no jobs were in jeopardy for at least the next year, and that he was looking forward to the merger. Once dinner was over, the music started in earnest, and Kimberly and I spun around the dance floor a few times. I think young people today have really missed the mark when it comes to dancing. Slow dancing with someone you love is such an intimate thing. It can bond two people almost as much as sex. Sometime in the evening, I felt someone tap me on the shoulder. When I turned around, I saw Carol standing there. Kimberly turned to see what I was looking at, and her eyes narrowed as she realized it was my ex-wife. Carol smiled sweetly at Kimberly. "Can I ask your husband to dance?" Kimberly looked at me, and then smiled at Carol. "Just as long as you remember where to return it." I took Carol out onto the dance floor, and we danced in silence for about a minute. "Michael, I just want to apologize to you for what Jacob and I did to you back then," she said, with genuine remorse in her voice. "You didn't deserve any of this. But when I discovered I was pregnant with Jacob's child, I knew it was over between us. I decided to make our breakup quick and simple. I didn't even think about how much it could hurt you. I shouldn't have let Jacob talk me into sticking with the scorched earth policy we were using. It was completely inappropriate." I chuckled slightly. Like people say, it's either water under the bridge or water over the dam. It doesn't matter now. We've all moved on. Besides, I kind of deserve some of it. I really beat the crap out of Jacob. Obviously, I didn't do too much damage to his reproductive organs because you had a second child. Carol giggled hearing this. We danced a little in silence, and I decided to bury the hatchet between us once and for all. "Listen, Carol," I began hesitantly. "I admit I was very sad when you left me for Jacob. It took many months to come to terms with the loss of you, but now we are both happily married and have children. I have come to believe that this was what was meant to happen." Carol suppressed a harsh laugh, and when I looked at her face, a tear was running down her cheek. "Did I say something wrong?" Carol just shook her head. "No, Michael. You didn't say anything bad. It's just not what you think. On the surface, everyone thinks we're the perfect couple, and for the first year, I would have agreed with them. But Jacob is just a charming manipulator. He uses people and then leaves them. I know he cheated on me many times, but he's not as smart as he thinks. Every time I find out he cheated on me, I cheat on him." My jaw dropped and Carol noticed. She grinned. "It's a hell of a way to live, I know," she said sadly. "I should have left Jacob when I found out what he really was like, but I was too ashamed and I was too proud. Michael, I'm glad you found happiness, but I will always regret leaving you. You and my children are the best thing that ever happened to me." We continued talking until the song ended. Carol then walked me back to my table and thanked Kimberly for letting her borrow me. As Kimberly and I danced our last dance that evening, it occurred to me that her advice all those years ago had been right. If I had refused to move on from Carol, it might well have consumed me. I think it's true what they say. When God closes a door, he opens another. When I lost Carol, I was completely devastated. But then God allowed me to find Kimberly, and I can't even imagine life without her. "So, what were you and Carol talking about?" Kimberly finally asked. "Is she trying to win you back?" I laughed and kissed her, as if she has any chance of doing that. "Okay," Kimberly said, resting her head on my shoulder. "Just remember that I am a jealous woman who loves one man. I will cut off your you-know-what if you ever try to leave me. I only brought this up because I heard their marriage is not all sunshine, light and rainbow." Carol told me the same thing, I agreed. "But I think they'll stay together for the sake of the kids. After the kids are grown, I wouldn't bet on this marriage surviving. What a sad way to live. Anyway, Carol told me something that I thought was funny. I know she wasn't amused at all, and I'm pretty sure Jacob won't find it funny when they get home tonight. What is this? Carol was standing behind her husband and he didn't realize she was there. Jacob was looking at you when he said, "That fucking Michael has won again." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.